Chapter 4 By the soul of the great Malebranche, who made a search after truth, and discovered everything beautiful except that which he searched for. By the soul of the great Malebranche, whom Bishop Berkeley found suffering under an inflammation in the lungs, and very obligingly talked to death. An instance of conversational powers worthy of envious emulation of all great metaphysicians and arguers. By the soul of that illustrious man, it is amazing to us what a number of truths there are broken up into little fragments and scattered here and there through the world. What a magnificent museum a man might make of the precious minerals if he would but go out with his basket under his arm and his eyes about him. We ourselves picked up, this very day, a certain small piece of truth with which we propose to explain to thee, fair reader, a sinister turn in the fortunes of Paul. Wherever, says a living sage, you see dignity, you may be sure there is an expense requisite to support it. So was it with Paul, a young gentleman who was heir presumptive to the mug, and who enjoyed a handsome person with a cultivated mind, was necessarily of a certain station of society, and an object of respect in the eyes of the manoeuvring mammas of the vicinity of Thames Court. Many were the parties of pleasure to Deptford and Greenwich which Paul found himself compelled to attend, and we need not refer our readers to novels upon fashionable life to inform them that, in good society, the gentleman always pays for the ladies. Nor was this all the expense to which his expectations exposed him. A gentleman could scarcely attend these elegant festivities without devoting some little attention to his dress, and a fashionable tailor plays the deuce with one's yearly allowance. We who reside, be it known to you, reader, in Little Brittany, are not very well acquainted with the manners of the better classes in St. James. But there was one great vice among the people about Thames Court, which we make no doubt does not exist anywhere else, viz. These fine people were always in agony to seem finer than they were, and the more airs a gentleman or a lady gave him or herself, the more important they became. Joe, the dog's meat man, had indeed got into society entirely from a knack of saying impertinent things to everybody, and the smartest exclusives of the place, who seldom visited anyone where there was not a silver teapot, used to think Joe had a great deal in him, because he trundled his cart with his head in the air, and one day gave the very beadle of the parish the cut direct. Now, this desire to be so exceedingly fine not only made the society about Thames Court unpleasant, but expensive. Everyone vied with his neighbor, and as the spirit of rivalry is particularly strong in youthful bosoms, we can scarcely wonder that it led Paul into many extravagances. The evil of all circles that profess to be select is high play, and the reason is obvious. Persons who have the power to bestow on another an advantage he covets would rather sell it than give it. And Paul, gradually increasing in popularity and ton, found himself, in spite of his classical education, no match for the finished, or rather finishing, gentlemen with whom he began to associate. His first admittance into the select coterie of these men of the world was formed at the house of Bachelor Bill, a person of great notoriety among that portion of the elite whom emphatically entitles itself Flash. However, as it is our rigid intention in this work to portray at length no episodical characters whatsoever, we can afford our readers but a slight and rapid sketch of Bachelor Bill. This personage was of Devonshire extraction. His mother had kept the pleasantest public house in town, and at her death Bill succeeded to her property and popularity. All the young ladies of the neighborhood of Fiddler's Row, where he resided, set their caps at him. All the most fashionable prigs or tobymen sought to get him into their set, and the most crack-blowen in London would have given her ears at any time for a loving word from Bachelor Bill. But Bill was a long-headed, prudent fellow, and of a remarkably cautious temperament. He avoided marriage and friendship, namely, he was neither plundered nor cornuted. He was a tall, aristocratic cove, of a devilish neat address, and very gallant, in an honest way, to the blow-ins. Like most single men, being very much the gentleman so far as money was concerned, he gave them plenty of feeds, and from time to time a very agreeable hop. His bingo was unexceptional, and as for his stark naked, it was voted the most brilliant thing in nature. In a very short time, by his blows out and his bachelorship, for single men always arrive at the apex of haut ton more easily than married, he became the very glass of fashion, and many were the tight apprentices, even at the west end of the town, who used to turn back in admiration at Bachelor Bill when, of a Sunday afternoon, he drove down his varmint gig to his snug little box on the borders of Turnham Green. Bill's happiness was not, however, wholly without alloy. The ladies of pleasure are always so excessively angry when a man does not make love to them that there is nothing they will not say against him, and the fair matrons in the vicinity of Fiddler's Row spread all manner of unfounded reports against poor Bachelor Bill. By degrees, however, for, as Tacitus has said, doubtless with the prophetic eye to Bachelor Bill, the truth gains by delay, these reports began to die insensibly away. And Bill, now waxing near to the confines of middle age, his friends comfortably settled for him that he would be Bachelor Bill all his life. For the rest, he was an excellent fellow, gave his broken victuals to the poor, professed a liberal turn of thinking, and in all quarrels among the blow-ins, your crack blow-ins are a quarrelsome set, always took part with the weakest. Although Bill affected to be very select in his company, he was never forgetful of his old friends, and Mrs. Marjorie Lopkins, having been very good to him when he was a little boy in a skeleton jacket, he invariably sent her a card to his soirees. The good lady, however, had not of late years deserted her chimney corner. Indeed, the racket of fashionable life was too much for her nerves, and the invitation had become a customary form, not expected to be acted upon, but not a whit the less regularly used for that reason. As Paul had now attained his 16th year, and was a fine handsome lad, the dame thought he would make an excellent representative of the mug's mistress, and that, for her protégé, a ball at Bill's house would be no bad commencement of life in London. Accordingly, she intimated to the bachelor a wish to that effect, and Paul received the following invitation from Bill. Mr. William Duke gives a hop and feed in a quiet way on Monday next, and hops Mr. Paul Lopkins will be of the party. Note well, gentleman is expected to come in pumps. When Paul entered, he found Bachelor Bill leading off the ball to the tune of Drops of Brandy, with a young lady to whom, because she had been a strolling player, the ladies patronesses of Fiddler's Row had thought proper to behave with a very cavalier civility. The good bachelor had no notion, as he expressed it, of such tantrums, and he caused it to be circulated among the finest of the blow-ins that he expected all who kicked their heels at his house would behave decent and polite to young Mrs. Dot. This intimation, conveyed to the ladies with all that insinuating polish for which Bachelor Bill was so remarkable, produced a noticeable effect, and Mrs. Dot, being now led off by the flash bachelor, was overpowered with civilities the rest of the evening. When the dance was ended, Bill very politely shook hands with Paul, and took an early opportunity of introducing him to some of the most noted characters of the town. Among these was the smart Mr. Allfair, the insinuating Henry Finish, the merry Jack Hookey, the knowing Charles Trywit, and various others equally noted for their skills in living handsomely upon their own brains, and the personals of other people. To say truth, Paul, who at that time was an honest lad, was less charmed than he had anticipated by the conversation of these chevaliers of industry. he was more pleased with the clever though self-sufficient remarks of a gentleman with a remarkably fine head of hair, and whom we would more impressively than the rest introduce to our reader under the appellation of Mr. Edward Pepper, generally termed Long Ned. As this worthy was destined afterwards to be an intimate associate of Paul, our main reason for attending the hop at Bachelor Bill's is to note, as the importance of the event deserves, the epoch of the commencement of their acquaintance. Long Ned and Paul happened to sit next to each other at supper, and they conversed together so amicably that Paul, in the hospitality of his heart, expressed a hope that he should see Mr. Pepper at the Mug. Mug, Mug, repeated Pepper, half shutting his eyes, with the air of a dandy about to be impertinent. Ah, the name of a chapel, is it not? There's a sect called Muggletonians, I think. As to that, said Paul, colouring at this insinuation against the Mug, Mrs. Lobkins has no more religion than her betters, but the Mug is a very excellent house, and frequented by the best possible company. Don't doubt it, said Ned. Remember now that I was once there, and saw this one Dummy Dunaker. Is that not the name? I recollect some years ago, when I first came out, that Dummy and I had an adventure together. To tell you the truth, it was not the sort of thing I would do now. But, would you believe it, Mr. Paul, this pitiful fellow was quite rude to me the only time I ever met him since. That is to say, the only time I ever entered the Mug. I have no notion of such airs in a merchant of rags. Those commercial fellows are getting quite insufferable. You surprise me, said Paul. Poor Dummy is the last man to be rude. He is as civil a creature as ever lived. Or sold a rag, said Ned. Possibly. Don't doubt his amiable qualities in the least. Pass the bingo, my good fellow. Stupid stuff, this dancing. Devilish stupid, echoed Harry Finnish across the table. Suppose we adjourn to Fish Lane, and rattle the ivories. What say you, Mr. Lobkins? Afraid of the Tun's stern laugh, which scarce the proud philosopher can scorn, and not being very partial to dance, Paul assented to the proposition, and a little party consisting of Harry Finnish, Allfair, Long Ned, and Mr. Hookey adjourned to Fish Lane, where there was a club celebrated among men who live by their wits, at which lush and baccy were gratuitously sported in the most magnificent manner. Here the evening passed away very delightfully, and Paul went home without a brad in his pocket. From that time, Paul's visits to Fish Lane became unfortunately regular, and in a very short period, we grieve to say, Paul became that distinguished character, a gentleman of 3 outs, out of pocket, out of elbows, and out of credit. The only 2 persons whom he found willing to accommodate him with a slight loan, as the advertisements signed X.Y. have it, were Mr. Dummy Dunaker and Mr. Pepper, surnamed the Long. The latter, however, while he obliged the heir to the Mug, never condescended to enter that place of resort, and the former, whenever he good-naturedly opened his purse-strings, did it with a hearty caution to shun the acquaintance of Long Ned. A parson, said Dummy, a wery dangerous morals, and not by no manner of means a fit associate for a young gemman of character like little Paul. So earnest was this caution, and so especially pointed at Long Ned, although the company of Mr. Allfair or Mr. Finnish might be said to be no less prejudicial, that it is probable that stately fastidiousness of manner, which Lord Normanby rightly observes in one of his excellent novels, makes so many enemies in the world, and which sometimes characterized the behavior of Long Ned, especially towards the men of commerce, was the main reason why Dummy was so acutely and peculiarly alive to the immoralities of that lengthy gentleman. At the same time, we must observe that when Paul, remembering what Pepper had said respecting his early adventure with Mr. Dunaker, repeated it to the merchant, Dummy could not conceal a certain confusion, though he merely remarked with a sort of laugh that it was not worth speaking about. And it appeared evident to Paul that something unpleasant to the man of rags, which was not shared by the unconscious Pepper, lurked in the reminiscence of their past acquaintance. Howbeit, the circumstance glided from Paul's attention the moment afterwards, and he paid, we are concerned to say, equally little heed to the cautions against Ned with which Dummy regaled him. Perhaps, for we must now direct a glance towards his domestic concerns, one great cause which drove Paul to Fish Lane was the uncomfortable life he led at home. For though Mrs. Lobkins was extremely fond of her protégé, yet she was possessed, as her customers emphatically remarked, of the devil's own temper, and her native coarseness never having been softened by those pictures of gay society which had, in many a novel and comic farce, refined the temperament of the romantic Paul, her manner of venting her maternal reproaches was certainly not a little revolting to a lad of some delicacy of feeling. Indeed, it often occurred to him to leave her house altogether and seek his fortune alone, after the manner of the ingenious Gil Blas or the enterprising Roderick Random, and this idea, though conquered and reconquered, gradually swelled and increased at his heart, even as swelleth that hairy ball found in the stomach of some suffering heifer after its decease. Among these projects of enterprise, the reader will hereafter notice that an early vision of the Green Forest cave, in which Turpin was accustomed, with a friend, a ham, and a wife, to conceal himself, flitted across his mind. At this time he did not, perhaps, incline to the mode of life practised by the hero of the roads, but he certainly clung not the less fondly to the notion of the cave. The melancholy flow of our hero's life was now, however, about to be diverted by an unexpected turn, and the crude thoughts of boyhood to burst, like Gillen's giant palm, into the fruit of a manly resolution. Among the prominent features of Mrs. Lobkin's mind was a sovereign contempt for the unsuccessful. The imprudence and ill luck of Paul occasioned her as much scorn as compassion, and when, for the third time within a week, he stood with a rueful visage and with vacant pockets by the dame's great chair, requesting an additional supply, the tides of her wrath swelled into overflow. "Look at you, my kinchin cove," she said, and in order to give peculiar dignity to her aspect, she put on while she spoke a huge pair of tin spectacles. "If so be as how you goes for to think as how I shall go for to supply your vicious necessities, you will find yourself planted in Queer Street. Blow me tight if I gives you another mag." "But I owe Long Ned a guinea," said Paul, "and Dummy Dunaker lent me 3 crowns. It ill becomes your heir apparent, my dear dame, to fight shy of his debts of honour." "Tara de diddle! Don't think for to wheedle me with your debts and your honour," said the dame in a passion. "Long Ned is as long in the forks as he is in the back. May old Harry fly off with him. As for Dummy Dunaker, I wonders how you, brought up such a swell, and blessed with the very best of heducations, can think of putting up with such vulgar associates. I tells you what, Paul, you'll please to break with them, smack it at once, or devil a brad you'll never get from Peg Lobkins." So saying, the old lady turned round in her chair and helped herself to a pipe of tobacco. Paul walked twice up and down the apartment, and at last stopped opposite the dame's chair. He was a youth of high spirit, and though he was warm-hearted and had a love for Mrs. Lobkins, which her care and affection for him well deserved, yet he was rough in temper, and not constantly smooth in speech. It is true that his heart smote him afterwards, whenever he said anything to annoy Mrs. Lobkins, and he was always the first to seek a reconciliation. But warm words produced cold respect, and sorrow for the past is not always efficacious in amending the future. Paul then, puffed up with the vanity of his genteel education and the friendship of Long Ned, who went to Ranelagh and wore silver-clocked stockings, stopped opposite to Mrs. Lobkin's chair and said with great solemnity, "Mr. Pepper, madame, says very properly that I must have money to support myself like a gentleman, and as you won't give it me, I am determined, with many thanks for your past favours, to throw myself on the world and seek my fortune." If Paul was of no oily and bland temper, Dame Margaret Lobkins, it has been seen, had no advantage on that score. We dare say the reader has observed that nothing so enrages persons on whom one depends as any expressed determination of seeking independence. Gazing, therefore, for one moment at the open but resolute countenance of Paul, while all the blood in her veins seemed gathering in fire and scarlet to her enlarging cheeks, Dame Lobkins said, "Effeeks, Master Pride and Duds, seek your fortune yourself, will you? This comes of my bringing you up, and letting you eat the bread of idleness and charity, you toad of 1,000. Take that, and be damned to you." And suiting the action to the word, the tube which she had withdrawn from her mouth, in order to utter her gentle rebuke, whizzed through the air, grazed Paul's cheek, and finished its earthly career by coming in violent contact with the right eye of Dummy Duneker, who at that exact moment entered the room. Paul had winced for a moment to avoid the missive. In the next he stood perfectly upright. His cheeks glowed, his chest swelled, and the entrance of Dummy Duneker, who was thus made the spectator of the affront he had received, stirred his blood into a deeper anger and a more bitter self-humiliation. All his former resolutions of departure, all the hard words, the coarse allusions, the practical insults he had at any time received, rushed upon him at once. He merely cast one look at the old woman, whose rage was now half subsided, and turned slowly and in silence to the door. There is often something alarming in an occurrence, merely because it is that which we least expect. The astute Mrs. Lobkins, remembering the hearty temper and fiery passions of Paul, had expected some burst of rage, some vehement reply. And when she caught with one wandering eye his parting look, and saw him turn so passively and mutely to the door, her heart misgave her. She raised herself from her chair and made towards him. Unhappily for her chance of reconciliation, she had that day quaffed more copiously of the bowl than usual, and the signs of intoxication visible in her uncertain gait, her meaningless eye, her vacant leer, her ruby cheek, all inspired Paul with feelings which, at the moment, converted resentment into something very much like aversion. He sprang from her grasp to the threshold. "Where be you going, you imp of the world?" cried the dame. "Get in with you, and say no more on the matter. Be a barbacle, drop the bullies, and you shall have the blunt." But Paul heeded not this invitation. "I will eat the bread of idleness and charity no longer," said he sullenly. "Good-bye, and if ever I can pay you what I have cost you, I will." He turned away as he spoke, and the dame, kindling with resentment at his unseemly return to her proffered kindness, hallooed after him, and bade that dark-colored gentleman who keeps the fire-office below go along with him. Swelling with anger, pride, shame, and a half-joyous feeling of emancipated independence, Paul walked on, he knew not whither, with his head in the air and his legs marshalling themselves into a military gait of defiance. He had not proceeded far before he heard his name uttered behind him. He turned and saw the rueful face of Dummy Duneker. Very inoffensively had that respectable person been employed during the last part of the scene we have described in caressing his afflicted eye, and muttering philosophical observations on the danger incurred by all those who were acquainted with ladies of a choleric temperament. When Mrs. Lobkins, turning round after Paul's departure, and seeing the pitiful person of that Dummy Duneker, whose name she remembered Paul had mentioned in his opening speech, and whom, therefore, with an illogical confusion of ideas, she considered a party in the late dispute, exhausted upon him all that rage which it was necessary for her comfort that she should unburthen somewhere. She seized the little man by the collar, the tenderest of all places in gentlemen similarly circumstanced with regard to the ways of life, and giving him a blow, which took effect on his other and hitherto undamaged eye, cried out, "I'll teach you, you bloodsucker, to sponge upon those as has expectations. I'll teach you to cozen the air of the mug, you snivelling way-faced ghost of a farthing rushlight. What, you'll lend Paul my 3 crowns, will you, when you knows as how you told me you could not pay me a pitiful tizzy? Oh, you're a queer one, I warrants, but you won't queer Marjorie Lobkins. Out of my ken, you cur of the mange. Out of my ken, and if ever I claps my seas on you again, or if ever I knows as how you makes a flat o' my Paul, blow me tight, but I'll weave you a hempen collar. I'll hang you, you dog, I will. What, you answer me, will you? Oh, you viper, budge and be gone. It was in vain that Dummy protested his innocence. A violent coup de pied broke off all further parlance. He made a clear house of the mug, and the landlady, thereof tottering back to her elbow chair, sought out another pipe, and, like all imaginative persons when the world goes wrong with them, consoled herself for the absence of realities by the creations of smoke. Meanwhile, Dummy Duneker, muttering and murmuring bitter fancies, overtook Paul and accused that youth of having been the occasion of the injuries he had just undergone. Paul was not at that moment in the humour best adapted for the patient bearing of accusations. He answered Mr. Duneker very shortly, and that respectable individual, still smarting under his bruises, replied with equal tartness. Words grew high, and at length Paul, desirous of concluding the conference, clenched his fist and told the redoubted Dummy that he would knock him down. There is something peculiarly harsh and stunning in those three hard, wiry, sturdy, stubborn monosyllables. Their very sound makes you double your fist, if you are a hero, or your pace, if you are a peaceable man. They produced an instant effect on Dummy Duneker, aided as they were by the effect of an athletic and youthful figure, already fast approaching to the height of 6 feet, a flushed cheek, and an eye that bespoke both passion and resolution. The rag merchant's voice sank at once, and with the countenance of a wronged Cassius, he whimpered forth, "Knock me down? Oh, little Paul, what wicked words are those? What, Dummy Duneker, as has dandled you on his knee, mony's a time and oft. Why, the cove's heart is as hard as junk, and as proud as a gardener's dog with a nosegay tied to his tail." This pathetic remonstrance softened Paul's anger. "Well, Dummy," he said, laughing, "I did not mean to hurt you, and there is an end of it. And I am very sorry for the dame's ill conduct, and so I wish you a good morning." "Why, where you be trotting to, little Paul?" said Dummy, grasping him by the tail of the coat. "The deuce a bit I know," answered our hero, "but I think I shall drop a call on Long Ned." "Avast there," said Dummy, speaking under his breath. "If so be as you won't blab, I'll tell you a bit of a secret. I heard as how Long Ned started for Hampshire this very morning on a Toby concern." "Ha!" said Paul, "then hang me if I know what to do." As he uttered these words, a more thorough sense of his destitution, if he persevered in leaving the mug, than he had hitherto felt, rushed upon him. For Paul had designed for a while to throw himself on the hospitality of his Patagonian friend, and now that he had found that friend was absent from London, and on so dangerous an expedition, he was a little puzzled what to do with that treasure of intellect and wisdom which he carried about on his legs. Already he had acquired sufficient penetration, for Charles Trywhitt and Harry Finnish were excellent masters for initiating a man into the knowledge of the world, to perceive that a person, however admirable may be his qualities, does not readily find a welcome without a penny in his pocket. In the neighbourhood of Thames Court he had, indeed, many acquaintances, but the finesse of his language, acquired from his education, and the elegance of his air, in which he attempted to blend, in happy association, the gallant effrontery of Mr. Long Ned with the graceful negligence of Mr. Augustus Tomlinson, had made him many enemies among those acquaintances. And he was not willing, so great was our hero's pride, to throw himself on the chance of their welcome, or to publish, as it were, his exiled and crestfallen state. As for those boon companions who had assisted him in making a wilderness of his pockets, he had already found that that was the only species of assistance which they were willing to render him. In a word, he could not for the life of him conjecture in what quarter he should find the benefits of bed and board. While he stood there with his finger to his lip, undecided and musing, but fully resolved at least on one thing, not to return to the mug, little Dummy, who was a good-natured fellow at the bottom, peered up in his face and said, "Why, Paul, my kid, you looks down in the chops. Cheer up, care killed the cat." Observing that this appropriate and encouraging fact of natural history did not lessen the cloud upon Paul's brow, the acute dummy Duneker proceeded at once to the grand panacea for all evils, in his own profound estimation. "Paul, my ben cull," said he, with a knowing wink, and nudging the young gentleman in the left side, "what do you say to a drop of blue ruin? Or, as you likes to be callish, I doesn't care if I sports you a glass of port." While Duneker was uttering this invitation, a sudden reminiscence flashed across Paul. He bethought him at once of McGrawler, and he resolved forthwith to repair to the abode of that illustrious sage, and petition at least for accommodation for the approaching night. So soon as he had come to this determination, he shook off the grasp of the amiable dummy, and, refusing, with many thanks, his hospitable invitation, requested him to abstract from the dame's house, and lodge within his own until called for, such articles of linen and clothing as belonged to Paul, and could easily be laid hold of during one of the matron's evening siestas by the shrewd Duneker. The merchant promised that the commission should be speedily executed, and Paul, shaking hands with him, proceeded to the mansion of McGrawler. We must now go back somewhat in the natural course of our narrative, and observe that among the minor causes which had conspired with the great one of gambling to bring our excellent Paul to his present situation was his intimacy with McGrawler. For when Paul's increasing years and roving habits had put an end to the sage's instructions, there were thereby lopped off from the preceptor's finances the weekly sum of 2 shillings and 6pence, as well as the freedom of the dame's cellar and larder. And as, in the reaction of feeling and the perverse course of human affairs, people generally repent the most of those actions whence the most ardently incurred, so poor Mrs. Lobkins, imagining that Paul's irregularities were entirely owing to the knowledge he had acquired from McGrawler's instructions, grievously upbraided herself for her former folly in seeking for a superior education for her protégé. Nay, she even vented upon the sacred head of McGrawler himself her dissatisfaction at the results of his instructions. In like manner, when a man who can spell comes to be hanged, the anti-educationists accuse the spelling book of his murder. High words between the admirer of ignorant innocence and the propagator of intellectual science ensued, which ended in McGrawler's final expulsion from the mug. There are some young gentlemen of the present day addicted to the adoption of Lord Byron's poetry with the alteration of new rhymes, who are pleased graciously to inform us that they are born to be the ruin of all those who love them. An interesting fact, doubtless, but which they might as well keep to themselves. It would seem by the contents of this chapter as if the same misfortune were destined to Paul. The exile of McGrawler, the insults offered to dummy Duneker, alike occasioned by him, appear to sanction that opinion. Unfortunately, though Paul was a poet, he was not much of a sentimentalist, and he has never given us the edifying ravings of his remorse on those subjects. But McGrawler, like Duneker, was resolved that our hero should perceive the curse of his fatality, and as he still retained some influence over the mind of his quondam pupil, his accusations against Paul as the origin of his banishment were attended with a greater success than were the complaints of dummy Duneker on a similar calamity. Paul, who, like most people who are good for nothing, had an excellent heart, was exceedingly grieved at McGrawler's banishment on his account, and he endeavored to atone for it by such pecuniary consolations as he was enabled to offer. These McGrawler, purely, we may suppose, from a benevolent desire to lessen the boy's remorse, scrupled not to accept. And thus, so similar often are the effects of virtue and of vice, the exemplary McGrawler conspired with the unprincipled Long Ned and the heartless Henry Finish in producing that unenviable state of vacuity which now saddened over the pockets of Paul. As our hero was slowly walking towards the sage's abode, depending on his gratitude and friendship for a temporary shelter, one of those lightning flashes of thought which often illumine the profoundest abysses of affliction darted across his mind. Recalling the image of the critic, he remembered that he had seen that ornament of the Athenaeum receive sundry sums for his critical lucubrations. "Why," said Paul, seizing on that fact and stopping short in the street, "why should I not turn critic myself?" The only person to whom one ever puts a question with a tolerable certainty of receiving a satisfactory answer is oneself. The moment Paul started this luminous suggestion, it appeared to him that he had discovered the mines of Potosi. Burning with impatience to discuss with the great McRawler the feasibility of his project, he quickened his pace almost into a run, and in a very few minutes, having only overthrown 1 chimney-sweeper and 2 apple-women by the way, he arrived at the sage's door.